Babylon revolted against the king, and I believe he was in Greece when the revolt took place. And he had to head back, and I believe he left a guy north of Greece named Mardonius, camped north of Greece with a troop of 40,000 troops or something like that. Mardonius. You can look into that. Okay, later, when grinding Persian taxation caused Babylon to decay, or later still, when the city was largely abandoned under the Macedonian Seleucid kings, that's after Alexander the Great had conquered, the priests could no longer afford to keep their buildings in repair. Thereupon they crumbled and dissolved into mud, as do all such structures when left to the elements. Under the Persians, ideas spread hither and thither around the Near and Middle East. Now, the Persian Empire undertook all of what was Babylonia, and up north of there into what the Assyrians held, and then clear east of there into what is Iran, and even over into Egypt. Let's let the dogs pass. At one time or another, it held as far as over to Egypt. So the Persians, now a huge, massive empire, biggest ever up to that day. Under the Persians, ideas spread hither and thither around the Near and Middle East. The Qanat system, Q-A-N-A-T, system of irrigation, for instance, spread far and wide from its Iranian homeland. The Qanat are underground tunnels that carry water. The domestic camel spread from Arabia to Egypt, where it made possible travel and trade across the waterless North African deserts. The Arabs, in their turn, learned about irrigation. Under the Sabaean kings, they built a huge dam at Ma'rib, M-A'-R-I-B, near the southwest corner of the Arabian Peninsula. This dam, said to have been started by the legendary Sheikh, S-H-A-Y-K-H, furnished irrigation to its valley for about 1,000 years before it broke down during a great flood. Although the lordly Persians were not on the whole a technically minded people, they did foster some engineering advances. The great kings improved the roads of their predecessors until their whole vast realm was knit by a system of highways. Over these roads the king's messengers galloped in relays, covering as much as 100 miles a day. These postmen rode on horseback and on mules, camels, and young dromedaries. That's a quote from probably an ancient clay tablet or something. Quote, on horseback and on mules, camels, and young dromedaries. End quote. And perhaps drove mail carts as well, depending on the condition of the road. By far the greater part of the highway system was only graded, not paved. Some of the steepest slopes, however, may have been eased by cuts and fills. We do hear of a couple of Persian engineers, or at least of Persians placed in charge of an engineering project. When Xerxes led his ill-fated expedition into Greece in 480 BC, he decided to dig a canal through the neck of the Athos Peninsula instead of sending his fleet around Mount Athos. That's just 100 miles or so north of Athens itself. 150 miles, something like that, north. Mount Athos, and it's a projection of 3 little peninsulas that come out, and his ships had to sail around them, and they lost a whole bunch of them in a storm, and he decided, I'm not going to sail around them this time. So when he came before in 489 or 492, I think, BC. Came again in 480 BC, and he said, we're cutting a canal through there. And they spent a couple of years cutting a canal through there, but they didn't sail around it. A Persian fleet had been wrecked there by a sudden storm 11 years before, during Darius' conquest of Thrace, and Xerxes was a cautious, methodical man who had been talked into this rash foray against his better judgment. Therefore the king placed in charge of the work 2 of his nobles, Barebus and Architachius. Herodotus explains how the job was done. Now the manner in which they dug was the following. A line was drawn across by the city of Sane, S-A-N-E, and along this the various nations parceled out among themselves the work to be done. When the trench grew deep, the workmen at the bottom continued to dig, while others handled the earth as it was dug out, 2 laborers placed still higher up on ladders, and these taking it passed it still farther up, till it came at last to those at the top, who carried it off and emptied it away. All the other nations, therefore, except the Phoenicians, had double labor, for the sides of the trench fell in continually, as could not but happen. since they made the width no greater at the top than was required to be at the bottom. So a lot of the nations had to dig more. They were forced labor taken by the king, right? For in the proportion of the work which is allotted to them, they began by making the trench at the top twice as wide, the Phoenicians did, as the prescribed measure. And then they dug downwards, approaching the sides nearer and nearer together, so that when they reached the bottom, their part of the work was the same width as the rest. But the sides weren't caving in, they didn't have to do any extra work. End of quote from Herodotus. Evidently the Phoenicians knew about the angle of repose of the earth of an embankment, but nobody else, including the two princely superintendents, did. The Persian king did not rule from any one single capital. Instead, they maintained 4 capitals and moved about from one to another in the course of a year. So, going a bit backwards from the idea of being nomads to the idea of being sedentary, and then the kings and their court probably traveled about, as did medieval European kings, because the transportation of food about the empire was not yet well organized. If the king, his household troops, and his horde of nobles, officials, servants, women, and hangers-on stayed too long in any one place, they would sweep the countryside bare of edibles and cause a local famine. Possibly. 3 of the 4 capitals were maintained in the great cities of Babylon, Susa, and Hagmantana. The kings also built a 4th capital, used mainly for ceremonies, at Parsa in the Persian hills of southwestern Iran. The Greeks called this Persepolis, Persian city, because opolis is city. Megalopolis, and so on. Persepolis. While each capital had palaces and audience halls, those at Persepolis were the most splendid. Here Darius, his son Xerxes, and his grandson Artaxerxes labored for decades to make Persepolis a magnificent royal center. The buildings, palaces, audience halls, barracks, treasury, and monumental gateways and staircases stood on a platform of scarped natural rock and limestone blocks, about 300 by 500 yards in area, which towered 40 feet above the plain and was in turn overshadowed by the mountain of mercy behind it. Of the many buildings on the terrace, the 2 audience halls were outstanding. Both were square in plan, about 220 feet on a side, with gleaming walls of mud brick covered with gold leaf. 36 columns, 7 feet thick and 65 feet tall, upheld the roof of the older audience hall. These slender columns were of the more delicate form than was usual at the time. They made the columns of the hypostyle hall of Ramses II look squat and graceless by comparison, even though I believe of a comparable height. The hall of 100 columns was similar, albeit the columns were smaller and more numerous. As the other of the 2 magnificent buildings they're talking about. These kings put up similar buildings elsewhere. In 331 BC, Alexander the Great burned the buildings at royal Persepolis. Historians disagree as to whether he did this in a drunken rage, as a piece of adolescent vandalism, or as part of deliberate policy to prove to the world the end of the Persian Empire. Very possibly. Kind of like the destruction of Dresden and Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Some think it was an accident, but we shall never really know. Strangely enough, the destruction helped to save some of Persepolis for us. Some of the stuff that they knocked down in the dirt and covered up with rubble never again stirred until archaeologists found it. The mud brick walls have dissolved away, and the earthquakes have shaken down most of the stonework. Only a few of Xerxes' graceful columns still rise against the bright blue Persian sky. Nevertheless, much more is left of these palaces than of the royal buildings in the other 3 Persian capitals. After Alexander's destruction, Persepolis was deserted, since it was at best a small town in a sparsely settled, mountainous land. Massive, wonderful buildings, and not really a very big population, especially later on, after the destruction of it. So the ruins remained much as Alexander left them. The other capitals, however, continued as great cities, and over the centuries the local people carried off the stones of the palaces for their own use, until today almost nothing is left of the royal edifices.